We are constantly told that workplaces are patriarchal, that men hold all the power, that women bear all the discrimination, and that sexism only flows in one direction. But what happens when men enter into female-dominated workplaces? Well, the research indicates that those men can face hiring bias, bullying, exclusion, physical exploitation, sexual harassment, and even institutional discrimination, often long before they are acknowledged and their issues are dealt with when requested. This episode is about discussing the gender bias in the workplace that no one wants to acknowledge. So, without further ado, I want to introduce this video by obviously explaining that I myself have experienced significant discrimination and even physical assault from female managers in my lifetime on a number of occasions. With rare exception, they have all been absolute tyrants, and I've always been accused of having a problem with women or being a misogynist. Now, clearly there are some female bosses that I've had, although very, very, very few, who have been supportive and nice, but disproportionately they have all been awful to me, particularly awful to other male staff, and even awful to some of the female staff as well. So just all around not very nice. In one of my most recent jobs, where I was treated appallingly, kept my pain and suffering to myself, and then eventually spoke out to HR, I was met with effectively termination of my employment for having raised concerns about my female manager. And so I had to fight that for 12 months, and it didn't end too well for that company. Now, let's talk about discrimination at the very start of the journey, so to speak. So what do we know? Well, we know that at the hiring level, men are facing significant discrimination. Okay, men and boys, I should say. So when effectively they've run studies on this, when men and women have applied for jobs and they've had the identical qualifications, what has become clear is that sex discrimination occurs against males more than actually females, at least nowadays. Okay, so what do we know? So there's an international study that was done, a massive meta-analysis of 361,645 work applications over a 44-year period, that found that there was no longer any anti-female bias at the point the study concluded in 2009. But what did persist was a stability of male discrimination by female employers. So let me restate that. Over this entire meta-analysis that was conducted of 361,645 work applications over a 44-year period, it was found that anti-female bias in the hiring process was no longer detectable. However, anti-male bias within female recruitment systems was stable and still occurring. Okay? That alone sort of completely brings question to the narrative around women facing all the bias in the workforce and the workplace. As a general rule, across that 44-year total period and that 300,000 or so work applications that they did this research on, that was found not generally to be the case, and that it was men that were still having the bias against them. So further still, what they also found was difference in how female recruiters versus male recruiters work. And what they found is that when female recruiters looked at female applicants, they gave them 4.7% more points in their application. And when that was compared to male recruiters assessing male applications, only 1.6 points was given to that male applicant. So what that demonstrates is that female recruiters significantly give advantage to female applicants. And even when male recruiters are given the opportunity to do the same, they do it at a significantly lower rate, approximately over half or thereabouts. Okay, so that's really important to consider, particularly when a man or a boy is going into a female-orientated workplace, and we know that it's going to be largely female recruiters. We know those HR teams are disproportionately female. Now, that was found in the Swedish study, but what was also found in an English study in schools across 5,000, I think it's 5,530 evaluations of the applications, male applicants were given on average 1.8 percentage points less for the teaching assistant roles and 1.3 percentage points less for just general teaching roles compared to women. So they were immediately disadvantaged in that application process. Now, it's true that for head teacher roles, those more senior roles, there was no real difference between the male and female applicants, but still what it did show is that those are teacher assistant roles or early teaching roles, those men were receiving less points than their female counterparts in that regard, which is automatically a concern for those men wanting to be teachers. Now, effectively, the next point I want to discuss is the fact that the men are the unprotected minority. Okay? So, when men become the minority, the assumption is still that they hold all the power, right? And that they can't be a victim. Their victimization becomes invisible still by virtue of them being a man. Now, what we've seen in other studies out of Sweden, and they have some great studies around things regarding gender equality and differences, as one of the countries in the world that's considered the most equal in society, or at least egalitarian, is that they found that female-dominated workplaces had significant levels of bullying. In fact, men experienced bullying at a rate of 2.06 times that of women, and they also received, I guess you'd call it, person-related bullying levels that were 1.89 times higher than women. So if we had to summarize that, on average in this Swedish study, men were experiencing workplace bullying at a rate 2 times higher than their female counterparts. Okay? So that's that study. And, you know, what does that look like? Well, it looks like I said in the opening, it looks like exclusion. It looks like the passive-aggressive behavior, the teasing, the taunting, the personal attacks, this kind of thing that are extremely anxiety provoking. And in fact, those men experienced later severe increased anxiety when compared with women in that case. In England, in the National Health Service, or National Health System, NHS, whatever you want to call it, men experienced bullying as well. So 19.9% of men experienced being bullied in the NHS, and 43% of them witnessed bullying. Now, the NHS is disproportionately women, not men. Okay? So, again, that it goes to show that male staff reported higher levels of bullying in these female-dominated workplaces, according to this data. Now, Interestingly enough as well, in similar workplaces like that, what we see is what you could call the useful man paradox. And what is the useful man paradox? Well, it is the fact that despite these men are being treated this way, they are still seen as useful for doing certain things that women don't want to do or are less likely to be physically able to do. So the men effectively can be treated as unwanted and disposable when they're seeking belonging within the workplace, but they're seen as indispensable when somebody needs to lift someone or restrain someone or provide protection against a physical attack. The men are expected to stand up to do that. And yes, of course, in society, we historically, since Noah was a boy, men have been expected to be the ones to go off to war and to fight and die for their country, their community, and their families. We accept that, but still, it'd be good if we could accept that and then not treat men and boys in the workplace terribly. Okay, so what did they find? Well, they found as well cross-culturally in the United States, Canada, and South Korea that male nurses were expected pretty much all the time to do the heavy lifting, the restraints, the dealing with agitated or violent patients, and in addition to that, conduct further protection duties that were really beyond the scope of their role as nurses, right? They're not security guards or police officers, but they're still expected to do those kinds of roles. And effectively, the paradox is that his strength becomes a workplace resource. The risk to his body and his need for protection are minimized still. So everything's expected of him, but his own protection is thrown out the window, really. So on that point, I want to also mention in Australia that, and this is horrifying, but in Australia in 2024, of the 188 workplace deaths, 180 were males. Okay? Were males. All right? Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that in Australia in 2024, of the 188 workplace deaths, 180 of them were male, which is 96% of the deaths, and that represents a rate of death of 2.4 male deaths per 100,000 versus 0.1 per 100,000 for females. Okay? That's effectively that men are dying in the workplace at a rate 24 times higher than women. Okay? That is terrible. That is an awful statistic to know, and it just adds a broader context to everything we're talking about. Now, in addition to that, if we look at coming back to male victimization in the workplace and being bullied, etc., effectively, the complaint system's trained to recognise only the expected victim, and largely the expected victim's usually seen through the gynocentric lens of it's got to be a woman, and it's treated that way, and the man is excluded from that. So what has been found that in these interactions where the men are being mistreated at work is that effectively, although 26% of men experience harassment in the workplace versus 41% of women experience harassment, so women did experience it more, those men that did experience it, in 44% of the cases, were harassed by women. So 26% of men who experience harassment in the workplace, okay, are effectively the victim of harassment by women. Sorry, my wording's not great there. Let me say it again. So of the 26% of men that report being harassed in the workplace, 44% of them also report that the harassment came from a female. Okay, that's just the data. Now, in South Korea, they found that male nurses, 66.2% of those male nurses reported being harassed, and 57.4% of them also experienced sex-based mistreatment. Now, sadly, 91.1% of those men who experienced harassment didn't report it and didn't get a help, and 58.9% of them expected that there would be no change anyway, even if they did make a complaint, which just goes to show how men seem to bottle up their issues at work, because it's not necessarily toxic masculinity. It's because they know that the fact that they're a man going to a female workplace, going to a female HR team for help, it's probably not going to end too well, and they're going to be met with questions and being accused of causing the issue themselves. Now, coming back to Australia as well, if we look at complaint outcomes with human resource professionals, it's interesting to see that 73% of human resource professionals are women, okay? They are women. It is a massively female-dominated space, and a lot of the time, male complaints are disciplined, right? The men making the complaints are disciplined, which is maybe why people in South Korea and cross-culture, these men don't make complaints. And what does that look like? Well, disturbingly enough, in Australia, it was found that of the people that were making complaints to human resources, it was found that when men made complaints to the Human Resources Department about being harassed in the workplace, 20% of them received disciplinary action, whereas only 5% of women who made the same equivalent complaints received disciplinary action. So men were experiencing disciplinary action for bringing concerns up about their harassment at a rate 4 times higher than that of women. That is abhorrent. Is it any wonder why men like myself and a lot of other men bottle it all up at work, and then we come home and we've got a beautiful partner or wife, and she asks how our day was, and we don't want to tell her anything, and then she feels like she's being emotionally neglected, or we take it out on her and we get angry, right? And in the worst cases, it might result in domestic violence, which is inexcusable, but this is where it can go, right? Now, the other thing, I guess, is that it's interesting when equality becomes unequal. So using a case study of the Queensland Police, they try to have a 50% recruitment drive on getting women in. And what they did is they specifically reduced the standards for women in that, and only specifically selected women. And they did that in such a way that they excluded 2,000 male applicants from processing further through the recruitment drive in Queensland Police. And that resulted in 200 male applicants who were more suitable for the role, had higher merit, going through in favour of women who had less merit. Now, that just means that not only are those women going into those roles with less preparation, they're a liability to the community, and they're a liability to themselves in terms of safety, and it just ruins policing and makes the community less safe. So that's an interesting case study to see that effectively a male minority bias can occur, and the female preferences in the policy can produce this kind of outcome where that many people are being excluded from the police force, which ruins the safety of our communities, in addition to the safety of those actual police officers, because the female police officers become a liability to everyone around them, and they're a liability to themselves as well. So look, there's a bit to unpack there. I'll keep this video short and sharp, I think. And I'd like to talk about this a little bit more in another video, and I'm glad to learn a lot about it. But thank you so much for your support to date, and please follow me obviously across my social media at Existential Evan. I'm on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook, and obviously here on YouTube. So please follow and subscribe, share this with as many people as you can, and please leave a comment if you'd like to as well. But that's all I've really got to say today, and thanks for tuning in. So yeah, anyway, as always, thanks for watching, and I hope you have a great day.